She had been here 6 weeks before I admitted to myself that I was counting. 6 weeks since the letter arrived with Senna's name on it, a letter that was almost correct, almost the proper introduction from old Halwick's wolf-keeping house in the Southern Valley, but not quite. The seal was right. The wording was nearly right. The order of the credentials, however, was wrong in 3 small places, and I had been keeper of Valestorn long enough to know that Halwick's house wrote their letters in a very particular way, because Halwick himself was a very particular man who had been doing things the same way for 40 years. I noticed on the day it arrived. I set the letter on my table and looked at it for a long moment, and then I looked out the window at the wolf yard, where old Merritt was showing the new woman how to approach the gray matriarch, Voss, without startling her. Voss had bitten the last 3 assistants Merritt had brought in. Voss walked directly to Senna's outstretched hand and pressed her great gray head into it. I left the letter on the table. I did not send anyone away. My steward Brantz found out about the letter discrepancies on the 3rd day. He brought them to me in the way Brantz brought everything, as a small, precise stack of concerns delivered with the expression of a man who has been patient for longer than anyone ought to be. "My lord," he said, setting the letter on my desk beside my meal, "the introduction from Halwick's house does not follow Halwick's form." "I know," I said. A pause, you know. "The credentials are listed in the wrong order. The closing salutation uses the formal address, which Halwick abandoned 12 years ago, and the ink on the seal is slightly too dark. Halwick uses a particular red that goes orange in lamplight. This one stays red." Brantz looked at the letter. He looked at me. "Then she is not who she says she is." "She is someone who needed to be somewhere," I said, "and the wolves took to her." This was, in retrospect, the moment I should have understood what was happening. I did not. I told myself, as I had been telling myself since the first morning, that the wolves' reaction was the practical concern. We had lost 3 assistants to Voss's temperament in 2 years. The pack had been unsettled since the illness that took 4 of our youngest wolves the previous winter. Old Merritt needed help that could actually approach the animals. These were the practical concerns. I was a practical man. I was the Alpha King of Valestorn, and I ruled 11 territories, and I made decisions based on practical concerns. Brantz said carefully, "Shall I inquire as to her actual origins?" "Yes," I said, quietly, "don't alarm her." He nodded and left. I ate my meal and did not think about the way Voss had pressed her head into Senna's hand on that first morning. I did not think about it at all. I thought about the Eastern grain reports, which were late, and about the summit with Lord Cavrith that was scheduled for the new moon, and about the cracked stone in the north parapet that the masons kept delaying about. I thought about absolutely none of it, and went to bed, and was awake before first light. This had begun happening around the 4th day of Senna's presence at Valestorn. I was not, by nature, an early riser. I had spent 11 years as the Alpha King of this hold building a schedule that suited the pace of governance and warfare, and the long, unglamorous labor of keeping 11 territories from tearing each other apart at every season's turn. That schedule did not include standing at my chamber window in the dark before dawn, watching the wolf yard for no reason I could name. I did not stand at the window that first early morning. I lay in bed and thought about the grain reports. Then I got up and went to the window because I was already awake and there was nothing wrong with looking at one's own wolf yard. Senna was already there. She moved in the dark with a small lantern, the kind the wolf keepers used when they did the pre-dawn welfare check on the pack. She was not supposed to be doing that yet. Merritt had not cleared her for solo pre-dawn rounds. She was clearly doing it anyway. She moved quietly, lantern low, and the wolves that lifted their heads at her entrance settled again almost immediately, the way they settled for Merritt, the way they had never settled for anyone else. I watched until the lantern disappeared into the keep side building, where the feed was stored. I went back to bed. I did not sleep. I got up and began my day earlier than usual and told Brance when he arrived with my morning reports that I had simply slept poorly, which was not untrue. This happened again the next morning, and the next. By the sixth morning, I stopped trying to explain it to myself, and simply accepted that I was apparently the sort of man who rose before dawn now, and went to my window and watched the Wolfe yard. This seemed, in the quiet of those early hours, like a fact I could live with. It did not yet seem like what it was. Brance's quiet inquiry took 8 days. He came to me on a gray afternoon with the look he reserved for information he expected me to dislike. "Her name is genuinely Senna," he said, which was his way of beginning with something positive. "Senna Varath, youngest daughter of Lord Edric Varath of the Pellenmore Estates. Minor lordship, respectable family, no wolves on their land, which explains the gaps in her practical knowledge that Merritt has been filling in." "She has no wolf-keeping background," I said. "None at all, my lord. She has, however, according to Merritt, an exceptional instinct for the animals and has learned in 6 weeks what most assistants require a full season to manage." He paused. "She is also, it appears, a recent fugitive from an arranged match. Her father agreed to a contract with the son of Lord Preth of the Eastern Holdings. The son is, by several accounts, an unpleasant man. She declined to go through with it. Her family disagreed. She left with a rewritten letter and, I gather, a very clear sense of direction." I looked at the reports on my desk. She forged Halwick's introduction. She copied the form very nearly correctly from a letter she had apparently once read in her father's study. Halwick wrote to Varath some years ago about a wolf sighting near the Pellenmore border. She had a good memory for the form, if not quite a perfect one. I thought about that. A woman who reads letters carefully enough to nearly copy their form from memory, years later, under pressure, while fleeing a life she didn't choose. A woman who then arrived at a northern hold that keeps wolves and presented herself to old Merritt with a letter that was almost right, and asked for work. "Does Merritt know?" I asked. "Merritt has known since the second day," Brance said, without surprise. "She did not inform me because, and I quote, she did not want to lose the best instinct she's seen in 30 years of keeping." I thought I might have made a sound, something quiet and involuntary. Brance's expression shifted very slightly. "My lord." "What does Lord Varath want?" I asked. "He has made inquiries. He is looking, but he does not appear to know where she has gone. The Preth son has reportedly moved on to another prospect." Brance set a small document on my desk. I took the liberty of drafting a response to the Varath household's general inquiry, indicating that no woman matching the description has been seen in Valestorn's territories. It requires only your mark. I looked at him. He met my eyes with the careful blankness of a man who has served a lord long enough to know exactly what he is doing and prefers not to say it aloud. I marked the document. "She stays," I said. "And Brance, she is not to be made uncomfortable. She is not to feel she is being watched or that her position here is uncertain." "Of course, my lord." He gathered the papers and left. I turned back to my desk and put my hands flat on the surface and looked at them for a long moment, and then I picked up the grain reports, which were still late, and read them, and did not think about the word Brance had not said. The word was, why? Why mark the letter? Why let her stay? Why had I known about the seal's ink color and the credential order and Halwick's old formal closing, and not said a word to anyone for 6 weeks? I did not think about why. It was not useful to think about why. I was a practical man. What I had not accounted for was Voss. Voss was the gray matriarch of Valestorn's pack, 13 years old, which was ancient for a wolf her size, and she had ruled the yard with a combination of absolute authority and selective savagery for the better part of a decade. She chose who she trusted. She had trusted Merritt for 30 years. She had tolerated me since I was a young lord who had learned, through several painful lessons, to approach her the right way. She had bitten, as I have said, 3 assistants. She did not bite Senna. More than that, by the 3rd week, Voss was following Senna. Not in the way the younger wolves followed her. They trailed after her with the frank enthusiasm of animals who had decided someone was interesting and safe and smelled right. Voss followed Senna in the considered way of a very old creature who has decided someone is worth keeping close. She would settle near where Senna worked. She would rise when Senna moved to another part of the yard. She would, in the evenings, position herself outside the small quarters Marit had given Senna in the keep-side building, and stay there until morning. Marit mentioned this to me in passing, with the cheerful tone of someone who finds everything about it entirely natural. I went to the wolf yard the next evening to see for myself. Voss was there, outside Senna's door, precisely as described. She was lying with her great head on her paws, eyes half closed, in the posture of an animal that is exactly where it intends to be. When I approached, she looked at me with the amber patience of something old and certain. I crouched near her. She allowed this. "I know," I said to her quietly, though I was not yet sure what I knew. She turned her head away, back toward the door, and closed her eyes. I stayed there for a while, crouched beside the old wolf in the cold evening air, and did not go in, and did not leave, and thought absolutely nothing useful for a longer time than a man with 11 territories and a late grain report could strictly afford. Then I went inside and did not sleep again for a long time. There were things about Senna that found their way to me without my seeking them. Marit reported on her progress each week, practical reports, wolf-keeping assessments, notes on which animals she had learned to approach and in what order and with what method. Within these reports, which were thorough and professional, lived small details that Marit included in the unconscious way of a woman who had spent 30 years with animals and found emotional truth unavoidable. Senna sang to the sick wolf heron in the evenings, not loudly, not in any way she seemed to think others could hear, but Marit had heard her twice, and the wolf's restless nighttime sounds had stopped. Senna had taken to keeping a small record of each wolf's behavior and temperament, which she had apparently begun without being asked, in a hand Marit described as very small and very neat. Senna had cried briefly and privately when the elderly male Roth declined through the autumn. She had been there when he passed, and Marit had found her sitting with him in the old way, one hand on his side, the way the wolf keepers did when they were saying goodbye. I read these reports. I read them the way I read everything that came across my desk, carefully, thoroughly, without visible reaction. I moved on to the next document. I did not retain, in any particular way, the detail about the singing, or the small neat handwriting, or the fact that she had sat with an old wolf through the night so he would not be alone. I retained all of it with perfect completeness, and have not lost a word of it since. My council met twice in those weeks. My lord advisors sat around the great table and spoke about the border situation to the east and the grain situation to the north, and the matter of the Cavrith alliance, and the slow question of succession that everyone was far too polite to raise directly, but that everyone was thinking about. I was 43 years old. I had not taken a mate. My wolf had been quiet on that subject for longer than I could remember, not absent, but still, in the way of something that has been waiting with an extraordinarily long patience for something that has not yet arrived. I had, in my 20s, believed that the mate bond was a legend, a thing that happened to other people, a thing that the old stories described in language too large to be literal. I had watched it happen to my cousin Merk and thought, well, that is Merk. Merk has always been inclined toward the grand gesture. I am not built for that. I had stopped thinking about it at all, somewhere in my middle 30s, and the years since had been unremarkable on that subject. My wolf did not pull me toward anyone. My counsel occasionally suggested names. I occasionally declined them. This was the rhythm of things. I had not, at any point, considered the possibility that the bond might arrive wearing a forged letter of introduction. It was Brant's who first said the word I had been avoiding. He said it sideways, in the manner of a man who has decided his lord needs to hear something and has spent considerable time working out the safest approach. We were reviewing the household accounts, a task I generally found soothing in its precision, and he set down his papers and said, "My lord, may I speak plainly?" "You usually do," I said. "The woman in the Wolfe yard," he said, "Senna Varath." I did not look up from the accounts. "Yes. You have marked a false document on her behalf. You have declined to question her directly about her origins. You are currently aware that Voss sleeps outside her door every night. You rise before dawn regularly, which you did not do before her arrival." A pause. "I am not making an inquiry. I am making an observation." I set down my pen. I looked at him. Brant's, who had been my steward for 16 years and had seen a great many things, met my eyes with the steadiness of a man who has decided to be brave. "The question I am not asking," he said, "is whether you are aware of what is happening." I said after a long moment, "I am aware." "Then I will not raise it again." He picked up his papers. "I merely wish to be certain you were not, in fact, simply an enthusiast of early mornings." Something that might have been a laugh moved through me. Something I had not felt in a very long time, brief and quiet, like a door opening onto a room I had forgotten was there. "I am not," I said. He nodded precisely, and we returned to the accounts. That night I lay in my chamber and let myself, for the first time since she had arrived, simply think about it. Not deflect it or file it under practical concerns or redirect it toward the grain reports. Just think about it. My Wolfe was not still. My Wolfe was the furthest from still it had been in 20 years. It had been like this since I was honest enough with myself, alone in the dark, to trace it properly, since the morning I watched Voss walk to Senna's hand. Since before that, maybe. Since the moment I read the not quite right letter and looked out the window and saw her standing in the Wolfe yard looking completely, quietly at ease, as though she had been there forever. I had been in love once in my 20s, with a woman from the northern coast whose family had eventually decided a less complicated alliance was worth more than a match with Veilstorn. That had been a real and human grief. This was not the same thing. This was older than that, and quieter, and it ran in a direction I did not fully understand yet because I had never felt it before. This was the pull that the old stories described in language too large to be literal. My Wolfe had been waiting this long. I found, lying in the dark at 43, that I had no argument to make against it. I thought about her singing to the sick Wolfe. I thought about the small, neat handwriting. I thought about the forged letter with its almost right form, and the clear sense of direction that had brought her here out of all the places she could have gone. I thought she came north. She came to the Wolves. She came here to this cold hold with her rewritten letter and her sharp memory, and she learned to do the work she'd said she could do, and she sat with Roth when he was dying, and she sang to Harren in the evenings, and Voss chose her. I fell asleep, finally, in the way of a man who has put something down that he has been carrying for a very long time without knowing he was carrying it. There were 2 more weeks of ordinary days after that. Ordinary in the way that everything ordinary is, once you know you are counting. Each morning noted, each evening its own small accounting. I saw her at the distance that my position at this hold and her position in the Wolfe yards created between us. Brief crossings in the outer corridors. A formal greeting in the yard when I came to consult with Merritt. The edge of a meal in the great hall where Merritt's staff sat at the long lower table, and I sat at the high one, and the distance was exactly correct for the circumstances, and felt, increasingly, like the longest distance I had ever maintained in my life. She was composed. That was the word I kept returning to. Not guarded, there was a difference. Guarded was what people became when they were afraid, when they were managing something. Senna was composed in the way of someone who had decided to be exactly who she was in whatever space she occupied. And if that space was a northern wolf yard she'd arrived at with a forged letter, then she would be that person fully and without apology. I respected it immeasurably. It was also becoming, I noted, a considerable personal difficulty. Brantz observed once that I had taken to reviewing the wolf yard management reports more thoroughly than any previous lord of Valestorn. I thanked him for the information. He said nothing further, which was either restraint or mercy, and was probably both. On the second-to-last ordinary day, I passed through the outer corridor near the keepside building in the late afternoon and heard, through the stone, the low, quiet sound of her voice. Not words, just tone, the same unhurried, unperformed quality she apparently brought to everything. One of the wolves answered her with a sound that was not quite a whine and not quite a sigh and sat in the middle somewhere, which was the sound Marit's animals made when they were entirely content. I kept walking. My steps were somewhat slower for the next corridor's length than they needed to be, but I reached my destination in reasonable time. That night I told myself, with some firmness, that I needed to simply speak to her. This was not a complicated situation. She was a woman who had come to this hold under slightly false pretenses and had then turned out to be exactly as capable and good-hearted as the pretenses had suggested she was. The practical concerns, her father's search, the original arrangement, the forged letter, were manageable. I had already managed them. What remained was the less practical matter, which I had also been managing very poorly for 6 weeks. I would speak to her. I would find a reasonable occasion. I was the Alpha King of Valestorn. I governed 11 territories. Creating a reasonable occasion was well within my abilities. I fell asleep with this resolution and woke before dawn, as I had been waking, and went to the window. And then I did something I had not yet done. I left my chambers. I do not know, looking back, what I thought I was doing. I pulled on my coat and my boots and went out through the side corridor, the one that led onto the inner courtyard before the wolf yards, and I thought, I am going to see about the cracked stone in the north parapet. I thought, I am going to review the outer gates. I thought a number of perfectly plausible things, each of which was absolutely false, as I crossed the inner courtyard in the dark of a very early winter morning with my breath making clouds in the cold air. The wolf yards were lit by the pre-dawn gray that comes off the snow when the sky begins to consider becoming light. The keepside building's small lamp was glowing. She was already in the yard, as she always was, as I had been watching her be from a window for 6 weeks. I came around the corner of the outer wall. The yard was very still. She was standing in the center of it in her heavy gray working coat, with Marit's old leather glove on one hand. She had been moving toward the water trough. I could see that was where she had been going, the bucket in her other hand, but she had stopped. She had stopped because the wolves had stopped her. They were lying down. All of them. Every wolf in the Valestorn pack, and we kept 14, which was a large pack for a hold this size, was lying in the snow of that yard, arranged in a loose circle around her, heads down, in the posture of absolute willing stillness. Voss was nearest, at her feet. The younger ones had their chins on their paws. The great dark male, Korth, who was the most restless animal in the yard and had never in his life been still voluntarily, was lying with his eyes closed. Senna had not moved. She was looking down at them with an expression I could not fully see from where I stood, but the angle of her head and the way she held herself told me everything. She was not surprised, exactly. She was looking at them the way you look at something you have been told you might love and have just discovered you love more than you knew. The bucket had gone, very still in her hand. My wolf went absolutely quiet, not the quiet of absence. The quiet of arrival, the quiet of something that has been moving toward a destination for a very long time, and has finally, in this gray cold yard with the snow and the lying wolves and the woman in the heavy coat, arrived. I am not, as I have said, built for the grand gesture. I have lived 43 years in the reasonable understanding that certain things are not for me. The bond that the stories described, the mate bond, the thing that arrived like a name you had always known but had never been given occasion to say. I was wrong about all of it. The bond did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like recognition, like the moment you hear a piece of music for the first time and understand, with total certainty, that you have heard it before. It arrived in the cold of a pre-dawn Wolfe yard, and it arrived quietly, the way everything about this had been quiet, and it filled every chamber of me with a certainty so large and so simple that I did not understand how I had been carrying its absence without knowing it was absent. Mine. Not as possession, not as command. As fact, the oldest, quietest fact. She was the one. She had been the one since before I had stood at any window. She had been the one since before she arrived, since before the letter, since before whatever long story had brought her from the Pellenmore estates to a northern Wolfe yard with a rewritten introduction and a very good memory. Veilstorn's wolves knew it. Voss had known it since the first morning. I had known it from the moment I chose not to send anyone away. I came down off the wall step into the yard. She heard me. Her head came around swift, the instinct of someone who has been careful for a long time, and she found me, and she went very still, with the bucket in her hand and the 14 lying wolves around her, and looked at me with eyes that were gray as the sky above us and wide with something that was not yet named. I stopped. I was perhaps 4 feet from her. The wolves did not move. Voss did not move. I said the only true thing that was available to me in that moment. I know about the letter, I said. I have known since the day it arrived. I marked the inquiry closed 8 days later. Your father's household will not find you here. She looked at me for a long time. Marat told me, she said, that you reviewed the Wolfe welfare reports more thoroughly than any previous lord. I did, I said. She seemed to think it was about the wolves. It was, I said, and it wasn't. The bucket lowered, very slowly, until it was resting in the snow. The gray light was beginning to shift, the early morning light that comes off snow when the sun is still below the horizon but already committed to the day. It touched her face. It touched the steady way she looked at me, with the composure I had been admiring for 6 weeks, and beneath the composure now something that was not hidden so much as waiting. The wolves, she said carefully, looking down at the 14 of them still and quiet around us, have been doing this since the 3rd week. I didn't ask them to. I know, I said. Voss has been sleeping outside your door. I know, she said. I didn't ask her to do that either. A pause. I thought it might be a problem. It wasn't, I said. The light shifted again. Somewhere in the hold, someone was moving in the kitchens, the distant sound of a morning beginning, the world's ordinary machinery starting up around us. I did not look away from her. I came here, she said, and her voice was very careful, because I needed to be somewhere that wasn't where I was. The letter was, I know the letter was wrong. I knew it was wrong when I wrote it. I had read the original once years ago and I thought I remembered it well enough. She paused. I was almost right. Almost, I agreed. I can leave, she said. It was not a request or a question or a plea. It was the statement of someone who has learned to hold their ground by being absolutely clear about what they are offering. If that is what this is, if you came down here to tell me that the letter was wrong and I should go. That is not what this is, I said. The morning held us, the wolves held still. I took 2 steps, which brought me close enough that she had to lift her chin slightly to meet my eyes, and I said, I came down here this morning because I have been getting up before dawn for 6 weeks and going to my window, and I stopped being able to tell myself. I was watching the yard for practical reasons approximately 4 weeks ago. And I am 43 years old and I have governed this hold for 11 years, and I have been, in that time, an unremarkable man on the subject of the mate bond, because my wolf was quiet and I assumed it would remain quiet. And then you arrived with a letter that was almost correct, and Voss walked to your hand on the first morning, and I have not slept the same way since." Senna looked at me for a long time. Then she said, with the very small, very private quality of something she had not been planning to say, "Your wolves kept bringing me things. Little things. A piece of pine bark, a flat stone, a bit of shed feather. I thought it was a pack behavior I hadn't read about." "It's not a pack behavior you'd have read about," I said. She understood me. I watched her understand me, watched the composure stay in place, and watched something deeper than composure move beneath it, something she had perhaps been keeping carefully behind the composure in the way of someone who has learned not to let things show before she knows it's safe. "Your wolf," she said carefully, "has been doing this through the pack." "For 6 weeks," I said, "perhaps longer than that." She looked down at Voss. Voss looked up at her with the amber certainty of an old animal who has been waiting for everyone else to catch up and has finally, mercifully, arrived. Senna looked back at me. "I rewrote the letter 3 times, she said. "I thought it was I needed to go north. I knew I needed to go north. I didn't know why north. I had never been to Valestorn. I knew it was a wolf holding. I thought, I can learn wolves. I thought, the letter just has to be good enough." "It was almost good enough," I said. "Almost," she said, and something in her voice had changed, lighter, a fraction lighter, the composure still entirely in place but moved by something that was not so careful. "You must have thought I was a very poor forger. I thought you were a very fast learner who had read a letter once and done extremely well under the circumstances," I said. The light was fully up now, the white winter light off the snow, clean and even. She was looking at me with the gray eyes that I had spent 6 weeks not quite looking at directly, and the thing between us that had been building for all of that time, that had been quiet and patient and wolf-sure, was simply present now, named, unhidden. I said, "Your father's arrangement is dissolved. Brant's confirmed the Preth son has moved on. You are under no obligation. I am telling you that so you understand that what I am about to say has nothing to do with what you owe anyone, because you owe nothing." She waited. "I am asking you to stay," I said. "Not as a wolf tender, though Marit will be devastated if you go, and Voss will be. I suspect Voss will simply refuse to let you leave, which would create a logistical difficulty. I am asking you to stay because my wolf has known what you are for 6 weeks, and I have been deeply unreasonable about admitting it to myself, and I am done being unreasonable about it." I paused. "And because you sang to Heron in the evenings, and you kept a record of every wolf's temperament without being asked, and you sat with Roth the night he passed, and I have not in 11 years of running this hold encountered anyone who did any of those things without being asked." Senna was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Marit told you about the singing." "Marit tells me a great deal," I said. "She is an excellent keeper and a completely transparent person." This time something moved across Senna's face that was unmistakably the edge of a laugh, controlled and small and entirely real. "She told me the Lord was unusually interested in wolf welfare," she said. She said it as though she thought I should find it reassuring. "Did you?" "I didn't know what to make of it," she said. "I thought, either the Lord is genuinely very concerned about the wolves, which is admirable, or there is something happening that I do not entirely understand, which is alarming." A pause. I had been trying to decide which it was. "And now?" She looked at me, at the wolves, at me. "Now," she said, "I think Marit knew what she was doing when she let me stay." "She did," I said. "She knew on the 2nd day." "She kept my secret." "She kept mine too," I said, "for approximately 6 weeks." Senna looked at the old gray matriarch, who was still lying at her feet with the serenity of an animal who has resolved a long-standing matter and would like to nap now. Then she looked at me and said simply, "Yes." I said, "Yes, what?" "Yes," she said, "I will stay, not because I owe it and not because I have nowhere else to go, Because I came north not knowing why, and I wrote a letter that was almost right, and Voss chose me on the first morning, and I have been—" She stopped. A breath. "I have been getting up before dawn to come here," she said, "every day. Not because Merritt asked me to. Because this is the only place where I have ever in my life felt that I was already where I was supposed to be." The wolves were very still around us. I reached out and she gave me her hand, the one without the working glove, the cold, bare one, and I held it the way I intended to hold it for the rest of my life, carefully, as though it was something I had been waiting a very long time to be allowed to hold. My wolf was quiet, the absolute satisfied quiet of arrival. Brantz did not say anything to me when I came back in through the side corridor, with the first full light of morning behind me. He was standing in the outer hallway with the morning's reports in his hands, as he always was, and he looked at me for one long moment, and then he looked at the reports. "The Eastern grain shipment has confirmed arrival," he said, "and the masons have finally committed to the north parapet repair." "Good," I said. "Will you be needing the large receiving hall aired out sometime in the coming weeks?" "Yes," I said, "I think I will." He nodded precisely. He made a note. He did not, with great professional discipline, make any further comment. He did mention, that evening, that Merritt had asked whether the wolf tender's quarters in the Keep Side building would require expansion, or whether a different arrangement might be considered in the fullness of time. I told him to tell Merritt that a different arrangement would in fact be considered, and that she should have whatever she needed by way of assistance in the yard in the meantime, and that I would speak with her directly tomorrow. He made another note. His expression, the one he had been maintaining all day, was the precise, careful, controlled expression of a man who has been proved right about something and is choosing, for reasons of dignity, not to mention it. I let him have the dignity. There are things that happen quickly in a life, and there are things that have been happening for a very long time before you were paying attention. Senna moved from the Keep Side quarters to the East Wing by midwinter. Veilstorn's custom was not to rush these things, and Senna was not a woman who rushed anything, and I was a man who had spent 6 weeks not admitting something and was not inclined to then do everything at once. We had time. That was the gift of the bond's patience. It had waited this long. It was not going anywhere. She learned the hold the way she had learned the wolves, thoroughly, quietly, without making a great deal of it. She kept her wolf yard work through the winter, because she wanted to and because Merritt needed her, and because the wolves, as I had predicted, were not prepared to have the arrangement changed. She sat in on the council meetings in the new year, initially at my request and then because she asked to. And because the Eastern grain questions turned out to be ones she had opinions about that were considerably better informed than anyone's expectations, given that she had grown up on an agricultural estate and understood land management in ways that 3 of my advisors apparently did not. Brantz said, after the third council meeting in which Senna had quietly restructured 2 of the Eastern supply arguments, that she appeared to be an asset. He said this in the tone of a man who had never doubted it. Lord Vareth wrote to me in the early spring. He was looking for his daughter, with the resigned tone of a man who has been looking for some time. I wrote back personally, a courtesy I did not extend to every inquiry, to inform him that his daughter was well and had found her place, and that if he wished to visit Veilstorn in the summer, he would be welcome, and could meet the man she had agreed to spend her life with. He came in summer. He sat at my table and looked at Senna, who sat beside me with her characteristic composure and her gray eyes and the very small smile she allowed in private company. He looked at the wolves that came freely through the outer yard and lay down in the sunlight. He looked at the hold which had, I had been told by Brantz and by Merritt and by 2 of my lord advisors, changed in some quality that none of them could quite articulate but all of them had noticed, as though a door that had been slightly shut had been quietly opened, and he said to his daughter, not to me, You wrote a very bad letter. I know, she said. It was almost right. Almost, he said, and looked at me and said, with the thoroughness of a man acknowledging something true, she has her mother's instinct for animals. I know, I said. He nodded. He stayed 3 days. He left on good terms. Winter came back around, as winters do. The pack grew by 3. Voss was too old to run with the young ones, but she presided over the new arrivals with the authority of a great matriarch. And she let Senna's hand rest on her gray head in the mornings in a way that she had never let anyone touch her. And she slept still outside, whatever door Senna was behind, though that door was no longer in the keep-side building. I am not a man given to large declarations. I said this at the beginning. I stand by it. But I will say this. There is a particular quality to the early mornings now. I still get up before dawn. I still go to the window sometimes in the gray pre-light and look at the Wolve yard. The difference is that I am not alone in the mornings anymore, and that the stillness of the hold at that hour is a different kind of stillness than it was before. Not the stillness of a man in a quiet room telling himself he has practical reasons for being awake, but the stillness of a life that has settled, at last, into the shape it was always supposed to be. Voss, on those mornings, looks up from where she lies in the yard. I have come to believe she is satisfied. I am satisfied. Senna, who rewrote a letter 3 times and came north without knowing why and learned the wolves in 6 weeks and sang to the sick ones in the evenings, is the reason I know what home feels like. That is the whole truth of it. That is the bond, stripped of every word I had for years considered too large to be literal. The old stories were not wrong about its size. They were only wrong in suggesting it arrived with noise. It arrived on a winter morning, in a yard full of lying wolves, with a bucket set down in the snow and a woman who looked at me and said, "Yes." That was enough. That has always been enough. That will be enough every morning of whatever is left to me, which I intend to be a great many mornings, and I intend to be awake for all of them.